Right, I think I'm live. I'm seeing it here, but I'm not 100% sure. So if something happens, I will upload the recording, and I can see that it's telling me something here is okay. Never mind. Um, this okay. So it's okay. Apparently, it's not streaming on one of the platforms, but it's okay. Let's just get started here with this cute little piping plover. And I've already sketched my little bird. And this is 140 pounds cold press arch watercolor paper. And I used masking fluid to mask around the bird. So when we paint the water and the sand around, I don't have to worry about getting any of that paint on the body of the bird. And that's because the bird has lots of white, especially here on the bottom. So I wanted to keep it nice and clean. Now the palette for this little bird is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Limited. So I'm only using yellow ochre, burnt sienna, French ultramarine, Payne's gray, and raw umber. And I'm using a variety of brands. So I have Daniel Smith, I have Winsor Newton, and I have a Holbein. But whichever one you have will work just fine, and we can mix all the colors we need with just these 5 colors. I also have a few round brushes. You don't need all of them. And I have, it's called a Chronos, which is a blend of Kolinsky and synthetic. I also have my trusty Da Vinci and my Skoda Reserva, which are all Kolinsky, and I love this brushes so much. I don't know if I'm going to use all of them, but I want to have all of them ready. So, going over our painting strategy, the first thing that I'm going to do is paint the water, and you can see on the upper left corner I have a sample of the painting. So we're going to do very, very diluted washes. This whole composition is made out of very diluted washes, except for the tip of the beak, the eye, and then the neck here, which is going to be really dark. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix some color. And here on the palette cam, I have a very diluted ultramarine. I'm going to dilute it even further. And I'm going to add a very small amount of burnt sienna, and that's so I can make it a little less saturated. So just a teeny amount and tons of water. So if we check here, see that is really, really light. I'm also going to add quite a bit of water to the yellow ochre. I might need to transfer this to another well because it's very concentrated here, and I want this to be super diluted. So let's see. Yes. So it's mostly water and just a touch of pigment. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to work the sky wet on wet. So I'm going to wet it with just clean water. And I'm going to make a horizon line here. So whatever the water is, that's where the paint is going to go. And you see I can go right over the bird without worrying that I'm going to get any paint there because I masked it. So I'm going to use gravity to my advantage and let some of that water flow downward here. And I'm going to check to make sure that I don't have any pockets of paint, of paper that is not wet. And if I have any excess water, I can just dry my brush really well and then soak up. All right. So everything is wet and the paper is shiny, but you see I don't have any puddles of water. It's nice and flat. And that brush is a little bit too big. So I'm gonna get a smaller brush and load it with my very diluted ultramarine with a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm just going to add a little bit of the paint and kind of let it flow. You see in the sample, the sky made is like super, super light. And we already blended the color really light, but it's even further blending with more water here, the water on the paper, so it's extra, extra light. I'm not, I don't want to cover every single bit of the sky, just a little bit, like here and there. And then right here on the horizon line, grab a little bit of my heavily diluted yellow ochre. I'm going to add it right at that line and let gravity do the work for me by letting it spread towards the blue. So that's good for the sky. And now for the water here, I'm going to hit the sky with a blow dryer so it dries, so we don't mix the sky with the water. And that's because I don't want the water to flow upwards. So I'm just going to quickly hit it with the blow dryer. Right. And as it dries, watercolor dries lighter. So now it's kind of like perfect, just as light as I need it to be. Now, there are two advantages of using the blow dryer. The first one is obvious. You can speed up the drawing time, the drying time, so you don't have to watch paint dry. But also it flattens the paper because even though I taped it to a board, and this is just a styrofoam board, I didn't stretch the paper, and that means when you soak the paper for about 15 minutes and then you stretch it and you staple it around. So the paper buckles pretty wildly when you don't stretch, but by blow drying it like so, it does flatten again. So now that we have the sky ready, we can paint the water, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to wet that area. So I'm kind of wetting right below the horizon line. You can go right up to the bird. Don't worry, it's going over the masking fluid, so that will stay protected. And that's because in watercolors, we work from light to dark because it's transparent. So when it's transparent, it means that you're going to see the layers underneath. So that's the reason why I didn't want any of the colors that we're going to use for the sand and the water to get into the body of the bird, so it doesn't get to see through to that layer. All right, so I'm just going to remove the excess because I do have a little bit of excess water on the sides of the tape. And I didn't go all the way down because I can have a little bit of dry brushing on the bottom. And again, I'm going to use gravity to spread that water evenly. I'm just taking a look. You see the camera is picking up really nicely. That I don't have any pockets. That doesn't have any paint. All right, so let's go back to our ultramarine. Now for the water here, I do want it to be slightly darker than the sky, so I'm going to add a little bit more pigment to the mix. And I'm going to start right at the horizon line. Same thing on the other side. Just trying to make the horizon line straight. And I'll just bring my brush around and add a little bit of that water. I'm going to quickly rinse my brush and pick up a little bit of that yellow ochre, which I'm going to add just a tiny more pigment for the same reason we did the blue. I'm going to start adding a little bit of the sand. I think I could use a tad more pigment, but I'm also going to add a tiny little bit of the raw umber. Just to make a little less yellowy. And let's check now and see if we got, yeah, better now. So it's a little bit, it's not as yellowy. And again, I'm just playing around here a little bit with this color. We're going to come back after this dries and add some wet on dry. So for now, I think this is just perfect. I want to have a bit more of the light showing through, so I'm just going to use a thirsty brush. So a thirsty brush is when you wet your brush, and if I can find my lab right here, and then you dry the brush really well to remove all of the moisture. Then you can kind of lift some of the pigment as long as it's still wet. So if there are any areas that you feel you have too much pigment, you can easily wipe it with a thirsty brush. All right, so I'm gonna hit this with the blow dryer again so it dries. All right, and before we remove the masking fluid, I do want to finish the sand and the water, and I'm just going to add some shadows. Of course, where the bird, is his legs here, it would be casting a shadow, so those would be darker. So I'm going to mix a little bit more of the raw umber into that yellow ochre mix. And I'm also going to mix a little bit of Payne's Gray. I think I actually might just add a little bit of the Payne's Gray to this ultramarine mix, just to desaturate it even more. Shadows are, usually desaturated, so they're not bright, and that's what the Payne's Gray is doing here. So let me test it first. It's a little bit, it's almost the same value, right? So I'm going to add a little bit more of the Payne's Gray. All right, let's see now. I think that works. Yeah, let's see how our raw umber with yellow ochre mixture is. I think it could be a little bit darker, right? So I'm going to add a little bit more yellow ochre. That made it too yellow, so I'm going to add more raw umber. I think it might have gotten a little too thick, so yeah, definitely too dark. I'm just going to add a little more water, and I'm just using my brush to scoop up some water and mix in with what I have on the palette. Oops, did go a little bit too light. Mixing color is a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and the more you do it, the better you will be able to gauge just how much pigment to water you need, and I think that's good. So I am going to switch to a smaller brush now, simply because I want to have a little more control. So I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of our darker raw umber mixture. I'm just going to look carefully now for the areas that I want, and these are going to stay hard edged, so we don't need to wet the paper. And I'm seeing a little bit of this here, and kind of goes a little bit further. And I might soften some of the edges, not all of them, just so I can have variation. I'm not going, everywhere with this mixture, because I also want to add a little bit of the Payne's Gray. So just so I can create a little variation in the value, I might soften a little, just a few of those hard edges. I can even drop in a little bit of the mixture to make some areas a little bit darker. Okay, just a little bit more going further. I think that is good. Now I'm going to take my Payne's Gray with ultramarine blue mix, and I'm going to add some, and they can blend. In fact, I want to, so if it bleeds into the raw umber mixture, that is perfectly fine and even desirable. I'm just using, so how far from the brush and I'm holding, that's so I can have more fluid, less controlled movements. And again, I'm going to soften, not completely. I don't want to lose all of the hard edges, just a little bit here and there. And here I'm going to put a little bit of a lighter blue. So I'm just gonna come with a little bit. Oh, way too light, but it's okay. I'm just gonna quickly quickly rinse the brush out and bring some water here. And I think that's good. Um, Let me see if I can make like the shadows directly under the bird a little bit darker. Let me get some of the raw umber mix. And if need be, I can actually, everything is way too wet here. So I'm just gonna dry a little bit so I can place some darker values right under the, and before I do that, actually, I want to take a little bit of more on the yellow ochre side, and maybe I'll make this here, just some harder edges here, and also a little bit darker, just so we can have a little bit more definition. Just a little bit. And I'll, whatever edges I feel like I needed to soften, I just use a little bit of water on the brush, and that's it. So I'm going to dry this and then put the last layer. Okay, so now I'm just going to layer over it, and I don't need to make the color darker because just by virtue of going over this darker value, it will make it even darker. So I'm gonna get more of the raw umber mix. I just want to come like directly under the feet. Create a slightly darker shadow. Here we go. Get a little bit more of this umber and just spread a little bit more, like so. And maybe a little bit more here on top of this little feet. All right, so that's good. And now I'm going to move on to the bird. So just softening a couple more edges, and then we're going to dry it really well so we can remove the masking fluid. So whenever you are using masking fluid, you always want to make sure that you dry the paper really well, because if you attempt to remove masking fluid when the paper is still damp, you probably rip the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and just have an edge here that I think is too hard as I look on the screen. It looks fine when I'm looking directly at the paper, but when I look at the screen, I feel like some of those edges could be softened a little bit. All right, so I'm going to dry it. And before I remove the masking fluid and continue with the bird, I just want to check and see if there are any questions. So give me 1 second while I switch. And I don't think there are any questions, but it was good to see how the camera is so perfect. All right, so I'm going back to the main camera here, and I'm ready to remove the masking fluid. Now, you don't need anything special to remove the masking fluid. You can just rub it off, but I do have lotion in my hands, so I'm going to use a masking fluid pickup. And it's just this, hard latex, which that's what the masking fluid is liquid latex. So when it dries, it protects the paper. And this is a hardened latex, so the same stuff that, the masking fluid is made, and you can use instead of just rubbing with your fingers. And maybe, even if I didn't have any lotion in my hands, I would still prefer to use something other than my hands to remove, just so I don't leave the natural oils. And sometimes, not always, if you get lucky, you can pull the masking fluid and the whole thing will come off like this. Now, like I said, it doesn't always work, but when it does, it's very satisfying. And voila, it did. So I'm really happy. And here is the masking fluid gone. So before I continue, I deliberately made some of the lines darker because when you do apply the masking fluid, it does remove some of the light. I mean, some of the lines, but now I'm going to remove some of it, and I'm using a kneaded eraser instead of using a regular eraser, because I don't like using regular erasers like a plastic eraser on watercolor paper, because the friction might disturb the texture of the paper. So I prefer to use the kneaded eraser. I'm just going to dab and lift. And sometimes you can even just scrape it a little bit like so. And that's fine. I don't mind if I see a little bit of the lines, but I do have a little bit of the line here of the beak that I'm going to redraw. So it's important to have an accurate drawing. So I kind of lost a little bit of this line here that shows the dark part of the beak. So in this case, it doesn't matter that the line is dark, because it's going to be really dark here at the tip. And I see that my feet, and this is a very simplified version of the reference picture. So I only have like some lines to show the idea of his little feet. And I think that's it. So we can now continue on painting the bird. So I always like to start with the eye, because I feel that once we paint the eye, it comes alive. And for that, I'm going to use a very dark mix of the Payne's Gray. So I'm going to get some here on the side. Oops. And with this, I have a little bit here. Just want to make sure I have some on the side of my palette here that it was dried, and I'm just mixing with a little bit of water just to lift the pigment. And I want very little water. Now I'm going to switch to a really small brush. I'm going to use I have a tiny little spotter here, so I have more control of the paint. Making sure that I don't have any beads of water on the ferrule. I'm going to paint the eye, and I do want to make sure that I leave that little catch light without any paint. But you know, if you accidentally get paint on the catch light, I did the eye a little bit bigger here, so you know it's more clear to see. So sometimes when you're making the eye, you know, very small, you might not be able to keep the catch light. It's okay, you can just put a little bit of white gouache. I'm just going to carefully and slowly paint the eye. And I really don't like to use straight black, so I prefer to use Payne's Gray. Now, Payne's Gray is a compound mixture, so it has more than one pigment, and some are bluer than others. For example, my Winsor & Newton Payne's Gray is very blue, as a matter of fact. And my Daniel Smith Payne's Gray is substantially more gray than blue. I also have a Holbein Payne's Gray that it's kind of like in between. And the one that I decided I want to use for this painting is the Daniel Smith, because I didn't want it to be so bluish. All right, so the eye is done. And since I have this color on the brush, I'm just going to add a little more water to dilute ever so lightly. And I'm going to paint the tip of the beak with it. I paint the bottom first because it's slightly darker than the top. And now I'm going to just add a little bit more water, even just to make it slightly lighter. And I'm going to paint the upper part of the beak. That's why I prefer to use a really small brush when I'm working in such a small area, because I have more control. And just my drawing, the beak was very pointy, and the beak is a little bit more rounded. Not much, but a little bit. So I'm just fixing that. All right. It's looking funny now because we only have this part painted, but once we put the burnt sienna there, will work. All right, so continuing with this tiny brush. No, I don't think we need this No, yeah, maybe we do. Sorry, just like, I'm thinking out loud. I will mix a little bit of burnt sienna, but I never mix my colors with my good brushes. I have an old one. So I never get rid of my brushes. I just kind of like demote them so they do these kinds of jobs. So I have an old beat up brush here, and that's how I'm gonna mix my burnt sienna. And I'm just gonna mix it with a little bit of water. I don't want it to be too light. So not a whole lot of water. So I'm gonna see if this mixture is good. If not, I can just add a little bit more pigment, or if it's too dark, I can quickly blot it and add it again with being a little bit lighter. So I'm gonna go right over this little opening here is the nair. So this is, the breathing. So I'm just gonna go right over because we're gonna paint that black. And by that I mean with Payne's Gray. So I can paint right over. So whenever you're painting um, something that is lighter and then you're going to put something darker on top, you can just paint right over it. It's just the other way around when you try to paint something lighter on top of darker, that it doesn't work. So if the nair were to be lighter, which almost never is because the nair is like a little hole that birds use to breathe, then I would make it sure that I would go with the light first and then the dark. And again, I'm just going over here one more time with the burnt sienna just to make the bottom mandible a little bit darker. So I'm just gonna grab a little more pigment here, very little, and I might make this even a little bit darker. Perfect, there we go. And when it dries, we'll paint the nair with black, the Payne's Gray, and also the separation between the upper and the lower mandible. Now, since we have this burnt sienna mix, I'm gonna rinse that brush because I don't need it for the little legs, and the feet can be a slightly bigger brush. But what I want to do, I want to mix a little bit of the yellow ochre with the burnt sienna. Okay, so burnt sienna here, I already have. And I'm going to take a little bit of the yellow ochre. And test it out. Yeah. And then we're going to have, the dark cast shadows, but that's going to be on the second layer. So let me go ahead and add this first layer because we're going to need to let it dry. I'm going to use a slightly larger brush here. Let me choose the teeniest one. All right. And we can just do a flat wash here. I think it can be just a tad lighter. So I'm going to add a little bit more water to the mixture. Then I'll just drag this with a little bit more water. And it will be the value that I need. And one thing that you always want to make sure when you buy your brushes to paint with watercolors, you want to get first of all, you need to make sure that you get watercolor brushes. They're specific for watercolor because they work differently than acrylic and oil brushes. But you want to make sure you get a good quality brush that has a nice sharp point, because that's very important on your watercolor brushes. It doesn't have to be the most expensive one. Now, if you do decide that you want Kolinsky, those are much more expensive. I haven't bought a Kolinsky in like, I don't know, maybe 20 years, but I do have those that I bought 20 years ago, and I take very good care of them, so they're still good as new. And this one here, I like Escoda brushes. They are excellent quality, really well made. And the Kronos line is a synthetic natural blend. So it has synthetic fibers and blended with sable fibers. So I like it. You kind of get the best of both worlds. All right, so that's the legs. When it dries, we'll come back and add the second layer. So now let's start putting the first washes on the bird. I think we can go back actually to the beak and finish it. So I'm just going to get a little bit of the Payne's Gray. Now back to my teeny tiny brush. I'm going to paint the mare. And I'm also going to mix it with a little bit of burnt sienna to make a very dark brown. And I'm going to put that line separating the top and the bottom. And it is a little bit darker here. And also underneath the beak. I think I can make this one here a little bit darker. And that's it. The beak is ready. The eye is ready. So now we can start on the body. And I'm going to start with the wings, and the wings is going to be a very diluted raw umber mixture. So just raw umber. Let me clean the palette so I have just the raw umber, because that one there had yellow ochre. All right. Oh, way too much paint. I'm gonna add a ton of water to make it really super light. So let's see. Yeah, that's good. Even a little bit more. All right, so now I'm gonna go up a size. And we're just going to start with a flat wash on the wings. And it's really, really light. I'm just putting a flat wash. I'm going to do the same thing here. There is this spot, and I'm going to go right over the dark spot where we're going to put the Payne's Gray there. And just add this. I'm also going to put a little bit right underneath this line here. We're going to come back with a diluted Payne's Gray to put there, but we also have a little bit of this raw umber there. This kind of comes like over the eye, and then it goes towards the beak. I'm gonna come back with just a tiny little bit of diluted Payne's Gray, but I just want to start with the other color that I'm seeing. So that's the first layer for the wings, and now let's put the layer for the body, and the body is just going to be a little bit very even more diluted than we used in the background, yellow ochre, and then very diluted Payne's Gray. So I'm going to start with the yellow ochre, and we're going to do this all wet on dry. So I'm going to apply a little bit, and then I'm just going to rinse the brush out and come back with just water. Because, you know, this part of the bird is actually white. So we're just painting a little bit of the reflections of the sand, and then a little bit of shading on the belly. So the shading would also reflect the colors around it. So a shadow is not gray. A shadow is multicolored, and it reflects the colors around it. So that's it. It's just a little bit of warmth. You can barely notice that there is that yellow ochre there. And I'm going to take very light mixture. Actually, I had a little bit of ultramarine there. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray. All right. I need even more water. All right, so let's see. Because shadows on white, they are very light. And I thought it was a little bit too dark, so what I did, I just picked up a little bit more water on the brush, and I'm just spreading that pigment. A little bit more shading here under the wings, because the wings would be casting a shadow. So this whole bottom area here would be a little bit darker. And it goes under the chin here, because that would also be casting a shadow. And then towards the belly. And I see also a tiny little bit right here, but very little. I'm going to actually apply a teeny tiny little bit of pigment and then dilute it further. A little bit outside the lines here, but no matter. All right, so now we got to the point where there's really nothing we can do on the body until it dries. So I'm just gonna hit it with the blow dryer. All right, so it's all dried and we can start working on the shading on the wings and the head, and then do this dark band of Payne's gray here. So I think I'm actually gonna start with that very dark value there so I can judge better how dark I wanna go with the shadows. And I'm gonna go down to a smaller brush again. And this is going to be mostly Payne's gray with just a little bit of water. So we get it really dark. All right, so let's see. And it's kind of like jaggedy. So I'm gonna make sure that I keep it like that as I paint. I'm just doing tiny little strokes. I'm gonna come back and do the strokes on the top like so. So both ends are a little jaggedy like this. And it does get a little bit wider on the chest. Sometimes when you're working with, more concentrated pigment and you only have a small amount of water, I would say I'm working here with the paint at like between milky and heavy cream. So sometimes you need to load the brush more frequently because there isn't a whole lot of moisture. And then I see here this gets a little bit lighter, so I am going to add a little bit more water to my mixture. And depending on how much pigment you have left on the brush, you can just add some more water. And it does get, narrower here as well. So yeah, I just want to make that transition. This one here went a little bit too thick, but it's okay. I don't mind that much. Okay. All right, so that part is ready. And I'm also going to add a little bit more water to the mixture so it's not as dark. And I'm going to come here and add that to the forehead. So again, I'm doing, this is a little bit lighter, so there's more water here. And I'm just going to let it fade in towards the lighter area. And also with this more diluted Payne's gray, I can come here and create this shadow that goes around the mask, around the eye. like so. I'm also going to darken it here. Because I don't want that lined like that, I'm just going to rinse the brush out, and with a little bit of water, I'm just going to run the tip while that is still wet, so I soften that and it doesn't look like just a line. So I'm going to soften it even a little bit more, just a little bit more water, so it can fade into the white. Just softening here as well. Okay, and now I'm going to start shading. Actually, while we still have that little bit of very light Payne's gray, I'm going to come right here, and this is a little bit dark. So I'm just going to mix it with a little bit of the raw umber. There's a shadow here that is being cast by the wing over the tail. And I'm going to rinse the brush out, and with just a little bit of water, I'm going to spread that so it looks a little more natural. All right, so now raw umber, a little bit more actually. Just want to make that mixture slightly darker than what we have, but not by much. So I'm going to start by creating some shading to define. Oops, that might be a little bit much, so more water. I'm just going to start defining. And you know, oops, got water here. We're not painting each individual feather. We're just kind of like putting some not definition, just like some impression of those feathers. And I'm going to create that by just pulling a little bit of shading in between that. And then, you know, there's a little bit, oops, of water. Just a little bit of shading here, and I'm kind of like creating a bit of texture. And that is kind of like denoting again some impressions of feathers. Just putting this. Just tiny little strokes. Okay, see, some just like some, you know, impressions there. I'm gonna come with a slightly darker burnt umber, and I just right here the individual feathers just to make them a little stand out a little bit more. There we go. I might even come with a little bit of shading here. I'm going to dilute that a little bit in a moment, but just adding a little bit just so the head has a little bit of more dimension. I'm going to take a little bit of that as well. And I'm going to put it underneath here to show that umber. Lots and lots of water. Okay, now I'm gonna make the wings under just a little bit darker, but I need to let that dry. So let's work on the legs and put the shading on the legs. So for that, I'm going to take the burnt sienna, not the one that we mixed with a little bit of, you know what, let me not use this brush. The one that we put on the leg with a little bit of yellow ochre, just the burnt sienna. And I'm gonna add a little bit, just a tiny little bit of the ultramarine, so it makes it a little bit browner. Very little. Let me check and see if I like it. Yeah. I'll make it just a tad darker, just a tad. So I'm just putting a little bit more pigment. All right, so let's see. That pigment. Actually, I diluted it a little bit because my brush was a little wet. All right, so let's see. So we have like a very hard shadow here, like a hard edge shadow that comes like this. So all of this top here will be darker. And if it's too dark, just rinse your brush and bring a little bit of water so you can highlight. So that shadow right there, I'm just going to, like, I'm not trying to outline, I'm just trying to add a little bit of shading to the side. And then on the feet, I've got that darker, kind of like putting a little bit of shading under the feet so it shows the separation between the feet and the reflection underneath. And I'm going to do the same thing here on the front, just a broken line. Okay, now I'm going to get a little bit more pigment. Let's see if this starts enough. And this shadow actually, first of all, we do have a line here. I'm going to come back with an even darker one, but this shadow comes like further down. So there's a lot more of this leg in shadow. And we are basically almost done. We just have to go back and add some shading to the feathers underneath the ones that we just painted. And then I'm going to do the same that we did. I'm going to bring this here and then make this a little bit darker. So just casting a shadow under the feet, and then I'm just going to separate the two. Like so. There's a little bit more ultramarine just to make a little bit darker, that brown. And I do want to put this here that shows that separation, right? In that, like the upper leg and the lower leg, maybe a little bit more shading here. And just like an indication of the textures that are on the feather, like the scaly textures. I think that's good. I'm not going to do anything else here. Don't want to get too carried away. she says as she continues working. That's good. All right, so now this should be dry enough that we can come back and add some more of the raw umber. Oops. Going to add just a tad of the Payne's Gray to that raw umber. Still with quite a bit of water because everything is kind of very light there. I just want it to be slightly darker than what we have on top. Maybe a little bit more Payne's Gray, just to make a little bit grayer. We also be able to separate the top from the bottom. All right. Just put like some lines there just to show, the separation between the different feathers. Now with a little bit more water, I'm going to put a little bit more shading underneath here and here. Tidy it up a little bit, right? Just gonna go around now and see what else, it needs something. I think this needs to be just a tad darker. Very, very little. So I'm just going to put a little more pigment there, and I did mix a little bit of yellow ochre on this mixture. Yeah, I think it's much better now. And I'm thinking that I could maybe darken that Payne's Gray a little bit there. Just a little bit. Yeah, much better. So that's adjusting the values a little bit. Okay, and maybe darkening this here with a little bit more raw umber, and then softening the edge, maybe a little bit more here. I don't want to get a full-on mask. Maybe darken. I have only the smallest amount of pigment on the brush, and I think it's done, right? I think I just want to add like a little bit, not an outline, just like a broken line on the belly and then on the rump, just to, let's see, it's very, very light. Nope, more water. Okay, yeah, just like this. And just making that, just a slightly thicker line there just to give more shading. Maybe I'll bring it over, make this here a little bit darker on the chin, and pulling it down. All right, so I'm going to remove it from the board. So it's very satisfying. So whenever you're removing the tape, always pull it away from the paper like so. Do it so gently, especially if you are not using 100% cotton paper. The wood pulp and cellulose papers, they are a lot more delicate, so they rip a lot easier than 100% cotton. Okay, and then pulling it here. Having the tape also creates a lovely border, which in this case is not making that much of an impact because everything is so light. But yeah, this here is a very simplified way of painting a quick watercolor, just a little over an hour, and we have a cute little painting here. And I hope you have enjoyed, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, even if you watch it later. And thank you for painting with me. And as always, I like to leave everyone off with lots of creative love. Bye everyone. Thank you.